As the late afternoon settled over Buckingham Palace, the London sky draped itself in a heavy shade of leaden gray. The wind skimmed across the cobblestone pavement, carrying with it the chill of the ancient city. In the vast courtyard before the palace gates, a crowd of tourists gathered, cameras held high, whispers filling the solemn air. Every gaze was fixed on the royal guards, the living monuments of discipline and honor. Among the unmoving ranks, Sergeant Ethan Cole stood as rigid as a human shield, his deep blue eyes unfocused on any one person, yet seeming to perceive everything. His crimson uniform was impeccably pressed, the brass buttons gleaming in the fading light. But he was not merely a sentry. He was a warrior who had fought in fire and blood, a survivor of brutal battlefields, bearing the scars of wars no one wished to remember. Yet here, amidst the ceaseless rhythm of the city, he stood, just as those before him had stood, guarding a tradition that had endured through the ages. Then the atmosphere shifted. A ripple of unease spread from the edge of the crowd as a man stepped forward, disrupting the stillness like a stone cast into a calm pond. Dominic "Dom" Hayes, a former convict, a familiar name in the city's darkest alleys. His gaze held no respect, only scorn and defiance. Twisting tattoos crawled up from his collar, spreading across his bare arms. His tattered leather jacket reeked of cigarette smoke and cheap liquor, each deliberate step an insult to the sanctity of this place. Dom approached, a sneer exposing his yellowed teeth. He was not here to admire the view, nor to honor tradition. He was here to provoke. Nearby tourists instinctively edged back, some murmuring in concern. A mother pulled her child away, while two veterans, men who had fought and knew all too well what was about to unfold, remained silent, their gazes sharp. But Ethan did not move. He had seen men like this before, those who lived by their fists, by intimidation, by the foolish belief that no one in this world could make them tremble. Dom halted before Ethan, his eyes gleaming with mockery. "So this is your so-called royal guard?" he sneered, his voice drawn out, dripping with contempt. The brass buttons reflected his twisted smirk in distorted mockery. The air seemed to freeze. The murmurs and laughter of the tourists gradually died down, replaced by averted gazes and wary glances. A cold wind swept through the square, carrying with it a growing tension that gripped everyone present. Yet amidst it all, Ethan Cole stood motionless, not moving even a fraction of an inch. Dom Hayes smirked at the soldier's silence. He had seen this type before, those who tried to appear strong but were hollow inside. He knew, or at least he believed he knew, this kind of person, puppets of the system, those who followed orders without question. And he despised them, silent as a statue. "Are we?" Dom took a step back, just enough to take in Ethan's entire uniform, his eyes scanning every detail with open contempt. "Does this bright red uniform make you feel special?" He reached out, his rough, scarred fingers brushing against the polished brass buttons on Ethan's chest. A blatant act of disrespect. No reaction, no blink, not even a glance. Ethan remained as still as a living statue. But inside, his blood was boiling. Not because of the personal insult, not because of the taunting words, but because Ethan knew Dom's kind, the ones who mistook silence for weakness, who saw discipline as fear. He did not understand, and perhaps never would, that this silence was strength. Nearby, a group of veterans exchanged glances. One of them, his hair streaked with gray, shook his head slightly. "He has no idea who he is messing with," he muttered dryly. The man beside him nodded, his eyes narrowing as he watched Dom's every move. Dom did not notice those looks. He only saw a man standing there, unresponsive. And he saw an opportunity. "You know," Dom said, his voice stretching out deliberately, loud enough for the crowd to hear, "I have met plenty like you. The ones who think that some worthless medals on their chest make them stronger." He raised a hand, his index finger tapping one of the medals on Ethan's chest. A light touch, yet enough to turn the air into a brewing storm. A young boy clutched his father's sleeve and whispered, "Dad, why is he doing that?" The father did not answer right away. He was watching Ethan, trying to understand what would happen next. Dom continued, He ran his fingers over each medal, treating them as if they meant nothing. This one, maybe for standing still the longest? He sneered. Or maybe for keeping the best poker face? No one spoke. The crowd held its breath. Then Dom's tone shifted. Lower. More cruel. Or is this one for your dead friends? For the first time, a slight change appeared on Ethan's face. A brief tension flickered across his jawline. No one but the seasoned soldiers could recognize it, but it was there, a deep current, a restrained force on the verge of release. And Dom, in his ignorance, saw it, and he thought he had won. He laughed loudly, turning to the crowd. Look at that. I guess I struck a nerve. But he did not know. He did not know that these medals were not mere decorations. He did not know that each one had been earned at a cost paid in blood, in pain, in sleepless nights under enemy fire. He did not know that what he had just mocked was the very soul of fallen soldiers, the brothers Ethan had once fought alongside and lost. Ethan took a slow, deep breath. He remained still, but in his eyes, the past came flooding back. Faces, desperate cries, the stench of gunpowder, the acrid taste of death. He remembered his comrades, the ones who never had the chance to stand here today. Dom laughed louder, savoring the moment he believed was his victory. He stepped in closer. So, Royal Guard, now I finally see that you are real. Then he made the biggest mistake of his day. He reached out and grabbed Ethan's collar. The crowd inhaled sharply in unison. Two veterans, who had been restraining themselves since the beginning, suddenly tensed. One of them placed a hand near his side, where a sidearm had once always rested. And that was when they knew the game was over. They had seen it before, in war, in life-or-death confrontations. The way a real soldier shifts from defense to attack. A cold wind swept through the square, stealing the breath from everyone present. Dom still had no idea what was about to happen. But Ethan did. There are moments in life when a person, no matter how foolish, realizes that they have just crossed a line from which there is no return. And this was that moment. Dom Hayes had spent his entire life in the shadows, using intimidation to control everything around him. He understood how to make people fear him. He knew how to make a man bow before him. But what he did not know, what he could not understand, was the difference between fear and the patience of a predator. And Ethan Cole was not prey. The moment Dom's rough hand grabbed Ethan's collar, the air seemed to be sucked out of the crowd. Those standing nearby held their breath, frozen in place. Some instinctively stepped back, as if they had just realized they were standing too close to an impending storm. Ethan did not blink. But inside him, everything changed. No longer just a ceremonial guard. No longer a silent monument standing to protect tradition. Now, he was a warrior. His breathing slowed. His heartbeat remained steady, as if he were standing in the middle of a battlefield. Years of training, days spent in the hell of war, all of it surged through his muscles like an electric current. He remembered the sleepless nights in the desert, rifle in hand, eyes never leaving his line of sight. He remembered comrades who had fallen because of a single moment of distraction. He remembered the times when he himself had been just one trigger pull away from death. Cold, precise, never hesitating. And now, someone like Dom thought he could lay hands on him without consequence? A mistake. Dom sneered, thinking he had won. So, Royal Warrior, still standing? But at that moment, he noticed something strange. His hand was still gripping Ethan's collar, yet he felt no resistance. No recoil, no instinctive flinch of a weaker man. Only silence. Silence like a cocked gun. Silence like a wolf that had just decided it was time to hunt. A chill ran down Dom's spine, but he shook his head, forcing the feeling away. No, he was in control. He was winning. He even tightened his grip, yanking Ethan closer. I bet you are not even allowed to move, are you? He chuckled, but something was wrong. Ethan's eyes. They were not afraid. They did not waver. They were watching, the way a lion watches its prey before it strikes. And in that instant, Dom Hayes, the man who had survived dozens of street fights, who had seen the flash of blades in dark alleys, who had ruled over the weak with violence, felt for the first time in his life that he was the weak one. His grip faltered. But it was already too late. A sharp thud rang out as the wooden stock of the rifle slammed straight into his chest. Dom's breath was ripped from his lungs, as if an invisible hand had squeezed the air out of him. His eyes widened, his body staggered, his feet scrambling against the stone ground. His mouth opened, gasping for air, but all he felt was the burning pain in his chest. He could not breathe. He could not move. He could not believe what had just happened. Ethan did not rush. He did not need to. He simply acted, with an almost emotionless precision. He had struck not out of anger, not out of pride, but because it was necessary. The crowd erupted with sharp intakes of breath. Some recoiled in shock. Others widened their eyes, unable to process what they had just witnessed. A moment ago, Dom Hayes had been the challenger, the one in control. Now he was just a man on his knees, clutching his chest, face pale with the realization of his mistake. He lifted his head, struggling to regain his image of dominance. You just hit me?" His voice was hoarse, breath ragged. Ethan said nothing. He simply returned to standing at attention, as if nothing had happened. But Dom knew. He knew something had changed. He knew he was no longer the predator, and he could not accept that. Humiliation burned in Dom's throat like fire. He clenched his fists, gritting his teeth as he forced himself to his feet. "This is not over," he snarled, his eyes burning with rage. "I will." But he never finished his sentence, because at that moment, Ethan moved. It was not an attack, not an aggressive motion. He simply raised his rifle, his posture flawless. And suddenly, Dom realized something he had foolishly overlooked. This was not just a decorative piece. This was not just a soldier who stood still. This was a warrior, a man who could kill him if necessary. Dom's fury shattered into fear. And when Ethan placed his finger on the trigger, lightly, not an overt threat but no longer a joke, Dom Hayes finally understood the truth. He had challenged the wrong man. He had crossed the wrong line. Truth has a way of revealing itself in the most ruthless manner when one least expects it. And Dom Hayes had just been shattered by the one thing he never saw coming: silence. Not Ethan's strike. Not the humiliation of collapsing under the watchful eyes of dozens. But the undeniable truth that he had lost control. For the first time in his life, Dom was not the one in power. He staggered to his feet, one hand clutching his chest where the butt of Ethan's gun had struck like a sledgehammer. The searing pain radiated through every muscle, but that was insignificant. What mattered was that the crowd had witnessed it. They had seen him get knocked back. They had seen him lose control. And in Dom's world, where power belonged only to the strongest, that was unacceptable. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to suppress the dread creeping through his nerves. No, it could not end like this. He had to reclaim control. He braced himself, willing his shaking legs to stay firm. His furious gaze swept across the crowd, searching for any sign of support, any lingering trace of fear in their eyes. But all he found was silence. No one cheered for him. No one laughed along with his act anymore. Worse still, he saw other eyes. The eyes of two veterans standing at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, observing the scene in silence. The eyes of men who had known real war, who had truly faced death. And in their gaze now, no fear, no admiration, only contempt, as if they were looking at a fraud, a pretender whose illusion had just been torn apart for the world to see. The shame burned Dom from the inside, and he could not bear it. He whipped around, his wild eyes locking onto Ethan, the one who had brought him to this, the one who had shattered his illusion of strength with a single precise strike. No, he would not let this be the end. He would reclaim his honor. "You think you've won?" he hissed, his bloodshot eyes blazing. "That was just a lucky hit." No one answered. Ethan remained still, his gun held in place, his posture rigid as if the confrontation had never even happened. That made Dom even more furious. He roared and lunged forward, but he did not realize he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He did not understand that there was an invisible boundary, a rule that could never be broken. Never touch a soldier's weapon. The moment his hand reached for the barrel, Ethan moved faster than his mind could process. No warning, no hesitation, only action. In a split second, Ethan pivoted, using the force of his movement to deliver a brutal counter. Before Dom could comprehend what was happening, he was on the ground again. But this time, he did not just fall. This time, he felt the cold steel of a gun barrel pressing against his forehead. The air shattered. The crowd stood frozen. Some had their mouths open in shock. Others clamped their hands over their lips, too terrified to even breathe. Ethan said nothing. He simply looked at Dom, and in his eyes, there was no threat, only a brutal truth, that if this were a battlefield, if this were a place without laws to protect men like Dom, his life would have ended here and now. Dom was paralyzed. Everything inside him collapsed. No more rage. No more arrogance. No more prideful ego. Only pure, unfiltered fear. For the first time in his life, he was truly afraid to die. Because deep down, in the darkest corner of his mind, he knew, without a shred of doubt, that the man standing before him had killed before, and would not hesitate to do it again if necessary. He trembled, his body frozen under the crushing weight of Ethan's gaze. His mouth opened, struggling to form words, to salvage even a shred of dignity. But nothing came out. The silence crushed him. Then Ethan did something crueler than death itself. He stepped back, lowered his gun, returned to his stance, as if Dom had never existed, as if he was not even worthy of being considered a real threat. That broke Dom more than any strike ever could. It was not mercy. It was rejection. Dom remained on his knees, shaking, his breath shallow, unable to lift his head. He had been defeated, not just physically, but completely mind and soul. He had lost, and the entire world had just witnessed it. Silence. A heavy silence. No longer the reverence reserved for royalty. No longer the curiosity of tourists, but the silence of sheer terror. Dom Hayes remained on his knees against the cold stone floor, his breathing ragged, sweat beading on his forehead. His body curled in on itself like a cornered animal, no longer arrogant, no longer defiant. He looked up, his gaze flickering in turmoil between the harsh reality before him. No one came to help him. No one reached out to pull him up. The crowd only stood there, staring at him with a mix of fear and contempt. And worst of all, Ethan no longer cared about him. The guard had returned to his original stance, rifle held firmly in place, eyes fixed straight ahead, as if the entire spectacle moments ago had never happened, as if Dom had never been a threat worth acknowledging. But Dom could not accept that. He clenched his teeth, fists tightening. Someone like him could not let it end this way. He could not allow himself to become a laughingstock in the eyes of these strangers. He had to regain control. He had to make them all remember him as a man who never kneeled. He had to make Ethan react. A snarl ripped from his throat as he sprang up like a wild beast, his feet slamming against the stone. He lunged straight at Ethan, and his hand touched the rifle. That moment stretched into eternity. A fatal mistake. In less than a fraction of a second, Ethan moved. No hesitation. No ceremony. Only pure combat reflex. A gunshot rang out. The sound exploded through the air, shattering the silence, making the crowd recoil, screams erupting, some instinctively stepping back. A spark flared from the barrel. The acrid scent of gunpowder filled the air. Dom froze mid-motion. He was not hit, but he did not need to be. The bullet had only grazed the stone right in front of his feet, leaving behind a scorch mark. But its impact struck harder than any blow before. Everything became painfully clear. No more games. No more provocations. No more just a guard. This was reality. The rifle was not an ornament. And Ethan was not some lifeless statue. He was a warrior, and he had just given Dom a chance to live. Dom could no longer laugh. His body trembled, his eyes filled with fear. Not because of the deafening gunshot, but because of the way Ethan looked at him. No anger. No resentment. Just a cold, silent warning. A message clearer than any words could ever be. If he dared take one more step, he would not just face a warning shot. The entire square was frozen. No one dared move. No one dared speak. Dom swallowed hard, his entire body paralyzed by the shock. He could hear the pounding of his own heartbeat. each thud like a war drum signaling his utter defeat. In the end, no words were needed. Slowly, Dom raised both hands, palms facing outward, a silent surrender. Two veterans in the crowd exchanged sharp glances. One of them gave a slight nod, as if they had just witnessed something inevitable. Because men like Dom always ended up this way. Because men like Ethan never let men like Dom win. A sharp siren wailed from a distance. The police. Security officers in bulletproof vests and armed with rifles emerged at the edge of the square, moving in with the precision of a tactical unit. They had heard the gunshot. They had seen everything. A commanding officer, his gaze cold and calculating, swept over the scene. He did not need to ask questions, because everything was already clear. A criminal kneeling on the ground, a guard standing firm, unshaken. The officer gave a sharp nod toward Dom. Arrest him. Two tactical officers surged forward, wrenching Dom's arms behind his back. He let out a hiss, struggling, but this time, no one cared. He had lost. No longer the one who threatened others. No longer the one who thought himself above the rules. Just a broken man being hauled away like a shattered puppet. As they dragged him past the crowd, no one spoke to him. No one looked at him with pity. Only one truth echoed in his mind, undeniable and absolute. He had challenged the wrong man, and he had paid the price. The wailing siren of the police car echoed through Buckingham Square, tearing apart the air already stretched as tight as a bowstring. But Dom Hayes could hear nothing anymore. He was being dragged away, his hands tightly cuffed behind his back, his steps unsteady from the aftershocks of fear. He did not struggle, not because he did not want to, but because he did not dare. Not after facing Ethan Cole's gaze. He was used to being the one who instilled fear, used to making those weaker than him tremble. But this time, he was the one trembling. Every ounce of arrogance, every shred of superiority that had once elevated him above others was now nothing more than a puddle at his feet. Worthless. And the worst part? No one looked at him as a threat anymore. He had been stripped of his very presence. Behind him, Ethan remained in place, unmoving, his posture unchanged, his gun still held at the ready, his gaze fixed straight ahead. But there was a subtle shift, a change that only real soldiers would recognize. He was no longer merely standing guard. He was protecting not just the palace behind him, but the traditions, the honor, and the pride of those who had stood in this very spot before him. And above all, protecting the lesson that Dom Hayes, like anyone else who dared challenge this boundary, would never forget. In the crowd, a young boy clutched his father's sleeve. "Dad," he asked softly, his voice barely a whisper against the vastness of the space. "The royal guards, they do not just stand still, do they?" The father looked at his son, then turned his gaze back to Ethan, his expression thoughtful. "No, son," he answered, his voice filled with respect. "They are real warriors." Nearby, an old veteran stood, his hair silvered with time, his chest still adorned with the faded medals of the past. He had witnessed many things, battlefields, loss, soldiers rising and falling. But few moments had ever moved him like this one. He stepped forward, saying nothing. Then, with all the respect of a man who had once worn the uniform himself, he raised his hand in salute. A veteran, saluting a soldier on duty. No words were spoken, but those who understood. Ethan did not turn his head. He did not need to, because he knew. Because that was what a royal guard did. They did not seek praise. They did not need recognition. They only needed to stand, an unshakable wall. Dom Hayes was shoved into the police car, the door slamming shut behind him with a hollow thud. He no longer screamed. He no longer cursed. He simply sat there, his empty gaze staring through the glass, toward the man who had defeated him without ever lifting a fist. Because he understood now, Ethan had not needed to beat him with force. He had won with patience, with dignity, with something Dom could never comprehend. And that was the greatest humiliation of all. The London sky turned a deep shade of indigo as the sun dipped behind the city's ancient towers. The wind swept through Buckingham Square, carrying the crisp chill of the late afternoon. Life went on. Tourists continued taking photos, and laughter gradually filled the space that had just moments ago been charged with tension. But something had changed. No one looked at the guards the same way anymore. No one saw them as mere living statues devoid of thought or presence. Because they had witnessed it. They had witnessed that behind the crimson uniform, behind the imposing tall hat, was not just a soldier on duty, but a true warrior. Ethan Cole remained in position, his stance unchanged, his rifle steady, his gaze fixed straight ahead. But something was different. Not about him, about the way the world saw him. A young boy stood close to his father, eyes wide with admiration. He no longer saw Ethan as a character from a fairy tale, but as a reflection, an embodiment of discipline, honor, and true strength. "Dad," the boy whispered. Was he scared? The father looked at Ethan for a long moment before offering a small smile. "No, son," he said. He was not scared, but he understands that strength is not in a clenched fist. It is in patience, in knowing when to stand firm and when to act. The boy blinked, as if realizing something important. Respect does not come from shouting or displays of aggression. It comes from control, from unwavering resolve, from knowing you are strong and not needing to prove it. A little farther away, two veterans stood in quiet observation. The older one gave a slight nod, a small yet deeply significant gesture. "He did well," he said in a low voice. The man beside him smirked slightly. No doubt, both knew that this situation could have ended very differently. They had seen too many men like Dom Hayes, those who mistook strength for brute force, for overpowering others. But they had also seen men like Ethan, those who understood that true strength is not about crushing the weak, but about holding firm to one's principles, even when tested. Inside the police van, Dom Hayes sat in silence. His eyes were vacant, his hands still trembling slightly. No more shouting, no more cursing, because he understood. He had thought he could break Ethan's composure. He had thought he could shatter the symbol that the soldier represented. But he was wrong. He had failed to make Ethan react on his terms. He could not force a true warrior to abandon his discipline. And that was his greatest defeat. Because for men like Dom, being ignored, being deemed unworthy of a response, was more brutal than being beaten down. So, what is the lesson here? Strength is not about having the loudest voice. Strength is not about who can intimidate whom. True strength is control. It is knowing when to speak and when to remain still, steady, resolute, unmoved by provocation. Remember this: the ones who scream the loudest are often the weakest. And the truly strong? They do not need to prove anything. Because, like Ethan Cole, they know exactly who they are. And that makes them unstoppable. Fire, what do you think about today's lesson? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thumbs up if this story made you reflect. Hit like and share it with those who need to understand true strength. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories about resilience, honor, and mental fortitude. And remember, not everyone who shouts the loudest is the strongest. Sometimes silence is far more powerful.